Hello, and welcome to episode 127 of the Book Binge Part 2 of my 2023 reading tier list, where you can see around me on the screen my already done ranking for the first part of this series, which I recommend you go back and watch, partially because I also, announced sort of the disclaimers and kind of what I'm going off of in the way that I form this video. But I will also mention in this one, I'm free to kind of move things around that are already up there if I see fit, as I continue along with the ranking. But I don't have too much to say in the introduction. I just kind of want to jump right into this and get on with part 2 of the tier list, starting with Gregor and the Curse of the Warmbloods, the third book in the Underland Chronicles. I talked about the first couple books last video, saying that they're pretty good. The first one's very good. I enjoy it quite a bit for what it is. The second book maybe follows the structure a little bit too closely and is kind of hampered by that. The third book mostly follows that same trend, but it starts to mature in certain ways with some of the thematic and tonal underpinnings of the story that make it a little bit more mature than the first two books were. And even though there's a little bit of character bickering and character relationship in this book that aren't handled as well as I think they could be, but they're handled as well as I also think they should be for a middle grade book, all things considered. I think this book is ever so slightly above that of Gregor the Overlander. I think this might have been the first one of these that I rated 5 stars on Goodreads, and part of that is because of this. Even though it is structurally, again, very similar to the first two books, I think it does satisfy just ever so slightly more than they do. Next up is another reread that I did this year, The Lost Hero by Rick Riordan, the first book in Heroes of Olympus, a favorite series of mine for sure. I've been trying to do a little bit of these rereads, trying to catch up on some of these books that I really loved and want to remind myself why I used to love them before I started BookTube. The Lost Hero greatly satisfied me. Amongst the general, community of Percy Jackson fans, and say like on Reddit or wherever else you might be, because I happen to follow that place. I don't know why. I rarely go on Reddit, but I am there nonetheless. The Lost Hero is a book that I think is underrated. I also think the main characters in the book are underrated. They're all new characters, following Percy Jackson's series. They are all new characters, so it is a little bit of a strange choice that Riordan made here, but it does have very great material in it. I do think it is an underrated book, not just in this series, but overall. It is one of Riordan's lower ranked books in, this sort of Percy Jackson universe, so to speak, and I never really understood why. I quite enjoyed it. I'm going to go ahead and put it in the middle of this pretty dang good pile, because I do quite enjoy it. I think it is very satisfying for me. The Way of Edan is next up, the first book in the Edan trilogy, all 3 books of which were published this year. You can see that I do have the next 2 books later in this ranking series. But The Way of Edan is a book that is special to me because it melds classic and modern fantasy in ways that I really like. It feels modern, has a modern yet also classic writing style that also has a setup in this book specifically that is very classic, so it kind of has this kind of amalgamation of what you might expect from a fantasy story depending on when it comes out. But this book is very special to me because it made me feel like writing. Whenever I would read this book in the mornings, I would want to put it down so that I could come to my computer and write, because it just put me in that mood, and that was kind of a magic that the book had that I really loved. Plus, the book wasn't too long, which you can't really say for the next 2 books in the series, which were a decent bit longer, and one of them which I wonder a little bit why it was as long as it was, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. The Way of Edan is a book that I'm going to put in cream of the crop, actually, because I do think it is a very, very good debut book. It might even be a better debut than like Empire of Silence by Christopher Rocchio, who is my favorite author. So I enjoyed The Way of Edan a lot. It had a magic that really worked for me, and is one that I'm gonna, shout from the heavens. This trilogy is quite good, and I think that everybody who enjoys fantasy, epic fantasy, should read it. The Son of Neptune, the second book in the Heroes of Olympus, is one that structurally is basically identical to The Lost Hero, actually. You just replace the heroes and replace the locations, and it's basically the same book, for better or worse. In this case, I think it is a tiny bit worse than The Lost Hero, even though, like, as Percy, and Percy is a great character, and I think that Hazel and Frank are probably better characters, maybe, than a couple of the main characters in The Lost Hero. But overall, because the book is so familiar to The Lost Hero, and I read it so shortly after The Lost Hero, that the quest in it is so identical to that in the Lost Hero. It's kind of hard to really count the two of them differently for some reason. They're also happening basically at the exact same time as each other in a timeline sense, so it's also part of why Riordan was doing what he was doing with the structure of them. But for this book, I'm going to go ahead and put it a little bit further down in Pretty Dang Good. It is basically in that same spot, but just a little bit below The Lost Hero for me personally. The Sea Wolf, next up, is a book that I feel a little bit conflicted about overall because I think Jack London is an author that maybe The Sea Wolf isn't the best introduction to. I had the wrong expectations going in. I thought it was going to be something that it wasn't, and there were aspects to the very beginning of it that had me thinking it was something that it wasn't. And then it also couldn't decide what it was. There were like 3 or 4 different things that this book was doing at different points in the story, and not all of them were done super well. At one point, it was kind of like a romance that certain people didn't really like. I didn't think was bad, but wasn't really what the story called for. At certain points, it was kind of like the antithesis or kind of an opposite point in argument to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, with characters that were very reminiscent of the 2 main characters in there that I thought were incredible in the philosophical discussions that were going on in there. So like the first third of The Sea Wolf was a book that I really like, but the rest of it is just kind of fine. It's not a book that I remember reading very much. Like if you were to ask me like which classics I read from the time that I started reading classics back in February 2022 all the way through now, because I've read nearly one a month for most months since that time, I almost always forget about The Sea Wolf just completely. I almost end up like being like, what did I even read in May of 2023? I don't know, and I have to go through some of my reading lists and remember that it was The Sea Wolf by seeing its cover. So that kind of goes to show that it wasn't exactly super memorable for me, even though I really enjoyed the beginning. This one's going to go in excuse me what, because even though I really enjoyed the first act of it with the philosophical discussions and, the Wolf Larson and the main character of the book being very similar to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, it could have been a lot better if it kept going in that direction of being a conversational piece to 20,000 Leagues versus deciding to do 2 or 3 different books over the rest of its course that weren't the same and also weren't fully satisfying to me. Gregor and the Marks of Secret, the fourth book in the Underland Chronicles, is where the structure of the series starts to change a little bit because it's really just the setup novel for the last book. It does technically have its own prophecy, but it isn't like announced in the same way the first 3 books do. It's not like here's a prophecy, now we have to do the 3-act structure dealing with the prophecy. Like, the first act of the book, and then you kind of start to worry about the prophecy. Then you have the search of the prophecy, like doing that quest. Then you kind of have the wrap up and resolution with the climax and everything at the very end. This book basically is, like I said, just a continuous setup novel for the last book in the series, and I think it's surprisingly good as such, even though it doesn't have that full, prophecy backing to it. In a way, I think this actually makes it a very much stronger book for me as an adult. Maybe the kids who really like the first 3 books because of the prophecies and stuff like that might not like it as much because of this, but I do think it is a stronger book on its own. Personally, I'm going to go ahead and put this just a little bit above Pretty Dang Good. Actually, I'm probably going to... Man, it's hard having so many books already in Pretty Dang Good and nothing else anywhere else, and it's like I don't necessarily feel like Gregor the Overlander is a better luck next time book, but I might as well go ahead and do that just because of the way that I've talked about them. I feel like that might be appropriate, but I will also go ahead and keep Tales of Sun Eater Volume 2 above those. See, this is what I meant by I have the right to adjust where these things place as time goes on, because I might feel a little bit differently after talking about certain books later in the ranking than I do at the very beginning. But let's actually talk about the finality of the series, which I think is a surprisingly emotional and impactful book, one that I really appreciate for what it was doing, and that wraps up all of the plot lines and deals with the character relationships and has a much more mature theme and tone to it, and a climax that is actually a lot more devastating than you would expect from a middle grade book. These last 2 books, The Marks of Secret and Code of Claw, really start to take the series in a direction that makes you wonder if they're meant to be more YA, whereas the first 3 books are a little bit more middle grade, so kind of like growing up with the kids who are intended to be reading it. That's very much what I felt like. Gregor and the Code of Claw isn't necessarily like, a book that everybody should read the series so that they can get to this book, but if you are in that age range, or you have a kid that's in that age range, or if you have a kid who likes you to read to them, I recommend this series, and this last book is one that might even affect you as an adult if you decide to do something like that. It is one that I really enjoyed upon the reread and was like, yeah, this absolutely holds up. And although the rest of the series may not hold up as being like my favorite series, this book is a lot of the reason why I would still consider it up there in my favorite series list, even if mostly for nostalgia reasons, but this book particularly gives it a reason why it's actually there. Next up is the beginning of epic fantasy series The Wheel of Time, a legendary series that everybody knows about, The Eye of the World. This is one that I find to be both underrated and not overrated, but the Tolkien comparisons in it are vastly overstated. I don't think they're nearly as, hurtful to the book as people claim they are, and I don't think they're as, big a deal as people think they are. I don't think this book is a Fellowship of the Ring ripoff at all. And some people actually get bothered by my saying that, but it's true. It's not a Fellowship of the Ring ripoff. There are certain things that are reminiscent of things from Lord of the Rings, but I never once, while reading this book, was like, this feels like Fellowship of the Ring. And part of that was why I enjoyed it so much. But while I went into this expecting a 3-star read, I came out of it having a pretty easy 5-star read, with the only real issue that I had with it basically being that the climax was a little bit rushed and confusing. I've gone back and kind of look at it a little bit differently now as the series has progressed, and I don't think it was necessarily that confusing, but in the moment it was a little bit rushed, and this is something that Jordan actually does a lot, I've come to discover. But I'm going to go ahead and put this in cream of the crop because it is a very good fantasy novel. I might decide to put this at the very top of Pretty Dang Good later, but I'm going to go ahead and put this here because I was so shocked with how much I enjoyed this book. Like I said, I went in expecting like a okay, I guess, 3 out of 5, and I came out like, this is a 4.5 out of 5. I'm running it up to 5 because I enjoyed it so much, and that's how I felt about that book. Robinson Crusoe, a book that I kind of got my channel name after, and obviously King Crusoe, Robinson Crusoe, like, obviously I'm named after this book, but the story behind that is a little bit different. I actually talk about that in the beginning of my review for the book, so check that out if you want to know why my channel is called the way that it is called. This book is one of the earliest English novels, and it surprisingly holds up in a lot of ways. There are aspects to it that aren't quite fully satisfying. At the end is a little bit confusing because it's like a totally different book for the last couple dozen pages that feels like it's leading up to like maybe a sequel or something, and maybe there's a sequel that exists that Defoe wrote to follow up on this, but I don't know if there is. But the general writing of it can be dry at times. The actual story itself isn't fully engaging at times. There's a little bit of repetition in here, even though a lot of like the material, like there are times where he just skips years of time because it's like, the narrator, who is Robinson Crusoe, is the narrator of the story. It's just like, nothing new happened over the next 5 years, so I don't need to tell you the next 5 years of stuff. So there's nice that, even Defoe knew that he wasn't going to get away with doing that kind of stuff. So, the book is simultaneously really good and really dry at places. I enjoyed it for what it is quite enough. But it isn't necessarily an all-time favorite. And people might expect me to have gone into this and been like, that's a favorite book of his, that's why his channel is named the way it is. But I hadn't actually read it before I made my channel name. But I am glad I did actually read it, and I enjoyed it quite a bit for what it was, even if there were certain issues with it, most relating to the fact that it is quite old. Malice. This is one of my more controversial takes in terms of like the fantasy sphere, let's say. This book was not great. There are aspects to the writing that I didn't really like. There are too many POVs that were secondary but felt like they should have been primary. There are some primary POVs that felt secondary because they weren't on screen enough. There were certain ways that the story was told and certain settings that just kind of characters went back and forth between places that, didn't keep me entirely engaged the whole way through. And part of this is because the first 200 pages are just a lot. There's a lot of names, a ton of names, so many names, in fact, that certain characters and certain plot lines, I got confused with other characters in different plot lines because I just straight up couldn't remember what characters were which. It just all got jumbled up in my head, and it's kind of a lot to ask for, even in a series as technically short as The Faithful and the Fallen is. I think that Malice is fine. but it definitely wasn't a book that I like really enjoyed. There were aspects to it that I really liked, but I'm going to go ahead and put this at the top of Excuse Me What, because I was expecting a little bit more from this, even knowing that Malice is generally considered the worst of the series by a heavy margin. I look back at it and I'm like, I don't know how much I actually enjoyed my time with that book, even though there is potential there. Hence why I'm putting it at the top of Excuse Me What here. I do want to go back and continue the series and actually finish the series at some later point, but it's not necessarily going to be like priority, and even if I do continue with Valor, that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to read all those next 3 books in a short time period. It might be that I finish Faithful and the Fallen somewhere around the time that I finish Wheel of Time, which probably won't be for like 3 years or something like that. I want to get to Valor at some point in 2024. We will kind of see what the schedule shows. But now for the last the last book that I'm going to talk about in this video, The Prophet of Adan, the next book in the Adan trilogy. I think this is the weakest of the trilogy for a few reasons, but there are some cool things that Philip was doing here that I think I will appreciate a lot more on a reread and maybe enjoy more when I do go ahead and, you know, reread the series again at some point later, because I will reread this trilogy more or less back to back, because there's a lot that I forgot or didn't catch fully that I want to, you know, experience better next time, because Prophet of Adan took me too long to read, Return to Adan took me too long to read, and it took me too long to get to Return to Adan after The Prophet of Adan. So it's, you know, one of those books that's like, I really want to get to this and reread it, because I'm sure I'll enjoy The Prophet of Adan more on a reread, but I did have certain problems with it. Partially, and I think mostly related to the pacing. There were certain points where it felt like battle was a little bit too much of what was actually happening on page, when it didn't necessarily feel like that's what needed to be being done. And there were times when it was confusing where the book was going, because what actually happens is the climax of this book is the climax that most people would assume would be for the entire trilogy. So you're here assuming like, okay, what are these characters going to do to make up this middle book? But then they don't really do anything to make up the middle book. There's only like 150 or 200 pages out of 600 in here that would be the middle book of the series, and then the rest of it is basically what you would expect to be in the book 3, and that kind of confused me. The pacing of that confused me a little bit. But like I said, I'll appreciate it more because I know where the series is going, and we'll talk about that more when I get to Return to Adan in the last video of this series in a couple weeks. But The Prophet of Adan is one that I'll put kind of here in Better Luck Next Time, because I didn't love this book, and it was kind of missing the magic of the first book that really made me love it so much. But there was a lot of really cool decisions made, there was a lot of really cool events, and stuff that I look back upon after finishing Return to Adan this morning, at the time that I'm recording this actually, that makes me, like I said, really want to reread the series, not just to re-experience the trilogy, but also so that I can appreciate The Prophet of Adan specifically a little bit more than I did the first time. But that is all that I'm going to talk about in this part 2 of the tier list. Thank you for watching. I'll be back next week with part 3. There's some great stuff coming up in this one. I hope to see you there. I'll be back next week for that one, just as I said.